Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. This particular interview needs very little introduction. You'll see that Michael VanHuis is well qualified to propose best practices to local churches. We also found during the interview that he touched on a number of topics that we've explored in the podcast. So in the show notes, you'll find a list of a bunch of different episodes related to the topics we touch on today. Our guest today is Michael VanHuis, who started serving in missions with a very fine mission agency, Michael, Pioneers.
That's right.
First serving as a missionary in Africa and later part of Pioneers' international leadership team and as the director of operations for Pioneers USA. Michael has also served as a missions pastor at a large church in the United States, on the leadership team of One Way Ministries, and now as the vice president of Missio Nexus, which is an association organization we'll hear more about in today's conversation. Michael and his wife Laura have 5 children and live in the Chicago area. Michael, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be here. Great opportunity to spend some time with you and talk to this great audience.
Well, I'll just add a quick personal word, how much I've appreciated getting to know you, Michael, and Laura, and very thankful for your service. Great to serve together with you. Now, you obviously have a very broad experience from that bio in global missions. Just take us back a bit first. How did you become passionate about helping the local church participate effectively in missions?
Yeah, as I was thinking about this, I think there's at least 3 or 4 different perspectives of looking at the local church and missions, and the Lord has allowed us to kind of sit in each one of those seats or have each one of those perspectives. And starting out as a missionary in the late 90s, we were, of course, sent out by the local church in partnership with our mission agency. And things, honestly, were not always smooth on either end of that relationship. And as the years progressed and we moved off the field into a home office role at our mission agency, my perspective on that vital church, missions, and agency partnership started to develop even more as I gained that new perspective sitting in the agency seat, not just the missionary on the field. Then, as you mentioned, the mid-2000s, I became a mission pastor at a church in Florida. And now I was the one caring for missionaries and prospective missionaries and working to create alliances with the mission agency. So again, my perspective changed and I looked at all the issues from different sides. And now we're at a small church that's trying to build a missions program. And as I sit in lay leadership and just a member of that church. And so another perspective looking at this. I think that there is more that we can do to be proactive no matter what seat we're sitting in. And I believe the local church is just absolutely crucial to the work of cross-cultural missions. And I want to do all I can, especially after all this time that God has given me to see this from different perspectives, to help strengthen local bodies to serve, to support, and to send out workers to the nations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the listeners to our podcast will have often heard this expression, which actually came from the Missio Nexus organization we'll talk about in just a minute. Steve Moore used to say, the church is the primary stakeholder in the Great Commission, not the only stakeholder, but the primary stakeholder. And we espouse that here through this podcast as well. So really congruent with what you've said, Michael. Just take a minute here and tell us about Missio Nexus, this association that you serve with now.
Yeah, Missio Nexus is now about 100 years old, 101 years old, an alliance of mission agencies and churches and mission educators from across Canada and the United States. We've got about 300 member agencies or churches representing around 30,000 missionaries around the world. So in many ways, it's become a pivotal association where you can come together to learn and engage and collaborate among the greater Great Commission community. And Missio Nexus offers all kinds of different resources, more than sometimes I'm surprised at what we offer. But we've got things from live events to research projects to webinars, our annual virtual conference, and all these different ways that people can be resourced to help carry out their part, their unique contribution to the Great Commission more effectively.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've appreciated being part of Missio Nexus, and I'll just add this here. We've done interviews with some of the other leaders from Missio Nexus, including Ted Essler, who is currently the president, as well as Marv Newell, who is one of the vice presidents there as well. We'll include those links in the show notes, as these gentlemen have helped us unpack especially trends in global missions, because they have this high-level umbrella view, an opportunity to engage at those high levels. And there are some Missio Nexus events coming up, both in Canada and the United States. We'll put some of those into the show notes as well. The material we want to dig into today is drawn from part of a recent survey done by Missio Nexus, and this is part of Michael's work there. Michael, as we turn toward our topic today about best practices, tell us a bit about the survey that provides the foundation for this and how our listeners could get a copy.
Sure, Max. About every 3 years, we conduct 2 companion surveys or studies. One is done among mission agency CEOs, and the other is done among church mission leaders. And this past fall, we released the latest report from those 2 studies that came out. And the Church Mission Leader Report overviews the perspective of about 150 church mission leaders from 150 churches, small to mega churches, the whole range there, looking at big picture questions related to things like how they carry out missions at their local church, to how they partner for sending, where they're working or serving globally. And the report will be available to this audience as a free download. I think in the notes attached to the program, we're going to offer that to everyone listening to this program. But it can also be found at missionexus.org. And if you want an actual print version, they're available on Amazon.com.
Super. Thank you for making that available. A special opportunity for our listeners there. We've taken a little bit longer in this introduction to introduce Missio Nexus because I think it is such a strategic organization for those of us serving from the North American context. There's just lots of great learning going on and great networking taking place. So thanks for helping us to introduce that, Michael.
Thank you, Max.
Now, some of our listeners will be very interested in getting to these best practices. We've identified 5, or Michael has identified 5. The first is this. As we want to help be effective in global missions from a local church, the first best practice is to identify potential missionaries. Michael, many will nod in agreement that their church needs to identify potential missionaries, but they don't know how to get started. What do you mean by this best practice, and how do we get started?
Yeah, well, kind of as a teaser to go get the actual report, in the middle of that report is, I think we list out 10 total best practices, and so we're just going to outline a few of them today. And many of these I learned through the crucible of leadership and through trial and error myself, realized how important these are. And I think the one that if I was to go back and be a missions pastor over again, that I would emphasize more is this first one we're talking about here, of identifying potential missionaries and being much more proactive about it in our congregation rather than reactive. And so I think there's 4 or 5 different ways that we can do this more effectively. One is by creating clear on-ramp for congregants to see pathways to the mission field that are attainable. And there's numerous ways of doing that. So maybe a few opportunities of what these clear on-ramps would be to help identify potential missionaries. One would be to create good learning opportunities at our churches. And I mean, education, teaching. So everything from a basic evangelism class, make sure there's always an evangelism class that's being taught at your church to help people get over their fear of sharing their faith. They're not going to think about getting on a plane and going overseas or going to someone who's very different from them, maybe that even lives in their own town, if they have a fear of sharing their faith. So those evangelism classes are essential. Or maybe something like a perspectives course. You can offer it at your church or find one that you can partner with. It's a great introduction to global missions. And I'm going to hold on one thought. I'll come back to it here in a second. The next would be short-term trips. I think it's crucial. There's a lot of commentary out there about the effectiveness of short-term trips, but I think short-term trips that are in partnership with long-term work on the ground is a great place for people to see, smell, touch, and live out the realities of cross-cultural missions. And it creates an open door for people to say and ask, what if? What if God may have something for me here? And then I would follow both of those things up, the teaching opportunities, the short-term trips, by open feedback loops, open doors to your missions leadership team that you can discuss and walk with people through their journey. So much of mobilizing or identifying new missionaries is the key of discipleship. And so much of discipleship is about developing relationships. And so the best way to do this is to find ways to spend time with our congregation to hear their heart and help shepherd them along this pathway.
Well, some great practical suggestions there. Do you find that it's typical? Are churches typically doing a good job of identifying missionaries, or is it something you think generally we have to improve on at this point?
There's always exceptions to the rule out there. And I know a couple of churches that are very good at creating these on-ramps. But I think most tend to be reactionary. Someone will come along and raise up their hand and said, hey, I'm thinking about going long-term, and I've already talked to an agency. What do I do? There needs to be much more proactivity in following up with people and building relationships. And I think the key here is discipleship. And I'm actually hearing a lot about that, especially from millennials who are talking about going to missions. They are looking for someone to walk alongside of them and disciple them in that journey, not just wait for them to raise up their hand and say, hey, I'm interested. What do I do next?
Well, in our experience, often the initial idea of missions doesn't take place in the local church. It happens maybe at college, could be a personal experience of some sort. It would be great to see the local church more proactive early on, of course. So there's that first best practice: identify potential missionaries and create on-ramps for that. The second best practice you've identified, Michael, takes us to something you've already alluded to, and that's strengthening or maybe building for the first time a missions team. Some churches call them missions committees. What do you have in mind here?
Yeah, and this is one of those I learned from the crucible of leadership, and started out in my role as a missions pastor with the weight. I was in a fairly large church, and so we had a lot of teams and missionaries and things already, and I bore that weight on my shoulders. And somewhere along the timeline, I realized, man, why am I doing this all myself? And so there are people around us in our churches that can come along in this journey, not just as those who are being sent out, but those who are empowering the overall efforts of our church around global missions. So one of the best ways we can mobilize people around cross-cultural work is to utilize them as part of a missions team. So that can look everything from short-term trip planning and management. That doesn't just have to be a staff person. That can be a group of people who help with those plans and all the details around mobilizing in short-term teams. Now, I think one of the other big ones is around global partners or national partnerships. When I was a missions pastor, we had 18 global partnerships, and I had another person from our church who was the point person for each one of those partnerships. And about every 6 weeks, we would meet as a council and talk through where everything was, and I could coach them in the relationships and help them build a team for each one of those partnerships. And these would lead to short-term teams going, to hospitality teams when our partners came and visited us. And this meant that we were multiplying the people in our church who had knowledge and passion and involvement in global missions. And it wasn't just me or a couple of staff members. We were multiplying the amount of people who were on a regular basis involved in cross-cultural missions.
That just sounds like such a great way to equip the church, not just deploying the care of the missions program to a specialist or maybe even just a few, but really dispersing that out and inviting people to have personal connectivity with mission workers or with mission projects. That's the way it's really going to multiply.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you could go on with other lists about caring for your missionaries that you already have and helping to partner with the agency more, caring for the missionary hospitality. And there's numerous of ways that you look at the responsibilities that you may feel you have to bear as a church missions leader, and looking at becoming a shepherd and a manager of those in your congregation who can actually do those things and be excited about doing those things.
I wonder if you have an example. Now, you've kind of given a bit of your own example, but does a church come to mind where you've really seen an effective missions team at work?
Yeah, there's a couple that I've interacted with over the past couple of years, and it's stuff similar to what I've talked about. Perhaps they have a partnership overseas, and they've rallied together a group of people who have just become deeply passionate about that partnership, gaining knowledge and information and growing together in caring for those relationships is substantial. And different churches, whether denomination or non-denominational, may have different ways of setting up these teams or councils, right. And that's fine. The point is, I think that you should do it and look at all that you have that you could be doing. And everything is scalable too. You don't have to get overwhelmed and say, I got to go out tomorrow and rally all these people. You can build it over time. You find, the early adopters who are already interested and start giving them things that they can do and being willing to release those things from yourself and your task list and move more into that shepherd type of role.
Mm-hmm. Well, here I'm going to pull back the curtain on an idea that our team is working on. Actually, an online course for a church group, could be called a missions team or a missions committee, to help strengthen that very body. Some creativity, some structure, and full of ideas on how that missions team can be strengthened. It's not quite ready yet, so I'll have to say more about that when it's actually ready. But so that it'll be available online, the idea really is to help a church get a clear vision that is manageable for their congregational size in these days, and to really move it forward, and it feels attainable. Another word that you used, it's realistic for the capacity they have at this time.
That's right. And there's a lot of people sitting out there in churches who just need to be asked. They have skills, they have knowledge, they have passion for different areas, and yet no one's engaging with them. And I think one of the biggest things is to start building relationships with your congregation. Different types of mission nights or prayer nights or coffee. Bring in coffee from one of the countries where you have workers in and just create opportunities for people to learn more and for you to get to know them and hear what's on their heart, and then help plug them into different roles that you may have. So it's going to help you, and it's going to help the church grow in their missions knowledge.
Super. Well, 2 great best practices. Number 1, identify potential missionaries. Number 2, build up the missions team. Number 3, the third best practice is distinguish local outreach from cross-cultural missions. What do you mean by this? Just unpack this a bit for us.
Yeah, this is actually, in my perspective, a pretty big one. And I think it's one where I see in the church today kind of a blurring of the lines. To steal from Denny Spitters and Matthew Ellison, everything, their book, When Everything is Missions, everything kind of becomes missions. I really think that there is a differentiation that needs to take place between local outreach and cross-cultural missions. So let me take a second and I'll just explain both of those or define them.
Sure.
So local outreach would be the things that we need to do because we are a local church in a local community. We have responsibility for those who are walking distance to driving distance from the doors of our building, and that's caring for the homeless and connecting with things that are going on in our community around us and providing care and opportunity. And I just heard about a local church in that horrific accident with Kobe Bryant not too long ago. There was a church that was right at the base of the mountain where that helicopter crashed. And that church became ground zero for all the medical people and all the news media. And there I had opportunities to share the gospel over and over again through the course of that crisis because they were a local church in their local community doing local outreach. And we're ready to do that. That's huge. But the other thing we need to do is be prepared to go cross-culturally, to go to cultures that are different than us. And traditionally, that's been getting on a plane and going overseas, and that still needs to take place. Mm-hmm. We know that there are thousands upon thousands of unreached people groups that still have no access to the gospel, and we need to see that happening. Yet we also see a changing dynamic of diaspora and refugee and immigrants who are now moving into our local context. But it's still very much a cross-cultural aspect of going to them, and maybe they don't even speak our language. They're still trying to understand what it means to be part of this new culture that they're in. So there is a difference between doing the things we need to do in our local community and the things where we're going cross-culturally to share the gospel with those who may not have ever had or have not encountered the gospel.
Mm-hmm. I hear you holding the two in a healthy tension. It's not an either or. Should we do local or should we go globally? You're saying we should do both. And
absolutely.
It needs to be done together. It needs to be done in a way that's manageable still, but
Yes.
that we don't abandon one or the other.
I totally agree. In fact, when I look at outreach and missions or even global missions, I always like looking kind of at the investment world and how a good investor will have a portfolio that's balanced of things that you're investing your money in so that you can grow. If one thing falls, another thing will grow. And taking that analogy a little bit to what we're doing in our local church, we need to have a portfolio and it needs to be balanced. And it's not an either or, it is a both and. We are called to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, and we should be involved in those. And now it may be different degrees at different times and who we have and what's available, but we need to be engaged both locally and cross-culturally.
Well spoken. Here I will just tuck in a reference to another podcast episode. It was number 91, and it's entitled Balancing Local and Global Mission Priorities with Pastor Doug Christgau, where Doug helps us unpack this very idea, even in a little more depth than we are today, but getting that balance. So we have our 3 best practices, the first 3. The first is identify mission workers or potential missionaries. Number 2 is build up the missions team. And number 3 is distinguish between local outreach and global cross-cultural missions. In just a moment, Michael will share 2 more best practices for local church leaders. Just before we get to that part of our conversation, we'd like to share a missions resource we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Do you have your 30 Days of Prayer for the Muslim World booklet yet? Join us in this focus month of prayer for our Muslim friends and neighbors. Ramadan begins on April 23rd this year. It's a time when Muslims are especially spiritually focused. So let's be praying together that they find Jesus. To learn more, visit 30daysprayer.com. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Michael VanHuis of Missio Nexus, who is sharing best practices for church leaders to help provide effective leadership in global missions. These ideas are being drawn from the Church Mission Leader Survey and the analysis that Michael has done on the part of Missio Nexus. The 4th best practice, Michael, is create global partnerships. What do you have in mind here?
Yeah, I think this is really important, and it helps our local churches get a global view, a global perspective, which is significant. And there's many examples out there of different global church partnerships that are forming these days. I hear more and more of healthy, strong, even multi-church alliances to support global partnerships that are around the globe. Partnerships with churches and ministries around the globe, I believe, will help awaken our congregations to the realities that exist for the majority world, whether that is partnering with another global church to send out workers within their region, or working together to care for refugees, or providing leadership training, pastoral training, orphan care. The list of possibilities is long and as diverse as the number of churches around the world are diverse. So, but it's essential that we build strategic key relationships.
I wonder if you could give us an example where you've seen this really work well for a local church with an effective global partnership.
The most tangible one is the one that I was most involved with, and that was at the church that I was a missions pastor. And we actually had 18 global partnerships, and we call them partnerships, although I would say that they ranged in their relationship. So some were more of a friendship. Some were deep, growing partnerships with mutuality in them. Some we had partnered at one time very deeply, and now we weren't actively partnering with each other, but we still had a relationship with each other. So sometimes that terminology of partnership can be a little bit difficult. And in fact, there is another resource on our Missio graphics page at missionexus.org. There is a Missio graphic on this idea of church partnerships that kind of outlines what healthy partnerships could look like. And I'll make sure that you guys have the link for that for this group. You know, just to give one example, we had a partnership with a church in Cairo, Egypt. And it was a deep partnership that formed over time. And I think that's one of the keys, is to not rush into things. And we didn't rush into things. We let the relationship grow and develop over time. It takes relationship. It takes getting introduced to each other and growing together, not us coming in from the West with an agenda, but coming in and walking alongside our brothers and sisters, especially if it's an established, well, all the time, but especially if it's a church that's already established overseas. God has put a calling and a mission upon them, and we're coming to walk alongside together. one of the things we realized, it was important for us to find a third party that we together could focus on. So our church and the church in Cairo together focused on a third party that we were both investing time and energy and resources and people to focus on that third party together. And over time, as we did that, there were more things that naturally started happening where we were blessing each other in the partnership because we were growing in our relationship by doing ministry together. And I think that's absolutely essential.
Well, some really good ideas here. And of course, we hear you saying that partnerships can look very different in different situations, and that there are seasons for partnerships, that they will mature or evolve even as time goes on. So they're not all going to look the same. It's not a cookie cutter.
That's exactly right. Look very, very different.
I wonder if you have any advice for a church that is hearing this and saying, we should think about really working on global partnerships. What would be a first step that you would recommend to them?
Yeah, I would really start praying, number one, and see if God is alerting you to a certain area of the world that your church feels compelled to for some reason. And I think the Holy Spirit will confirm what that is. And then it's starting to look around and ask questions and find potential partners that could be out there. And there's a number of different places to go to. Maybe it's another church, or there's a few catalytic partnerships that are out there today that you could engage with. And if you don't have any relationships out there, but that point of getting introduced to someone is essential, rather than just saying, hey, we feel called to a certain country and getting on a plane and landing there and walking around in the streets. That's probably not the most effective way of going about it. But finding an introduction that you can get introduced to. And then once you get introduced, like I said before, take things slowly, let the relationship develop. In fact, I remember a trip to Brazil to go talk to a partner, and we were sitting down over a meal, and there were a few of us, and we wanted to dive into our ministry stuff together. And he kind of smiled and leaned back in his chair and said, hey, friends, here in Brazil, we eat and we talk about life. And when the meal is over, then we talk about ministry. And we also, well, let's develop that relationship first and go deep in our relationship. And there's going to be plenty of time to dig into the meat of what we're going to do together. But the relationship is essential.
It's a very good word. We have our ways, sometimes from the West, and we have lots to learn from our global partners. Thanks for sharing from your personal experience there, Michael. So we have that fourth best practice is to create, and I might even say cultivate, global partnerships. The fifth and final best practice we'll touch on today is to know your agency partners. Those with whom you are cooperating. I hope they would be helpful in the previous point, maybe establishing some of those global partnerships. Why else do we need to get to know our agency partners, Michael?
Yeah, I think that if we are going to effectively care for missionaries, we need to have, again, a deep relationship here between church and agency. And so much of it is intentionality. I would just bold and highlight and underline that word multiple times. It's intentionality. We don't just want to know our missionary. We want to know who they're serving with and why they're serving with them. And I think that from a church perspective, if we have the resources, we need to go visit those agency partners, get in their office, see who they are, see what they're about, more than you can find out just from a website or a phone call. If possible, have someone from their team come and visit you. And they're often very willing to do that. Again, depending on which organization, the size that they are, they may even have someone who's regionally in your area who could come to your church office and interact with you or your whole missions team. Find out key people in their organization in mobilization or church partnerships or member care and field leadership so that you have phone numbers and emails and reference points, names that you can develop a relationship with over time. And I'd say one other thing that I would highly recommend that more and more, I'm hearing more and more churches of doing, but building an agreement or a statement of understanding between the church and the agency. To be proactive in finding who's responsible for what in regards to the missionary care, training, and support. And there's a lot of misunderstanding out there, essentially because we didn't have time or didn't take time to define out who's responsible for what when it comes to a missionary.
Well, our agency, or the agency that I serve with, Send, is now deploying documents just like Michael just described. We call it a global ministry agreement, which clearly delineates in a fairly short document. It's only 4, maybe 5 pages, which clearly describes what are the expectations and responsibilities of the sending church or supporting church. The missionary family is the second party, and the sending agency is the third. And we found it very helpful. I'll put a template in the show notes as well. If that's of interest to you, you can have a look at that and you could follow up with us as well. There's some very fine ideas, Michael. We've just touched on these 5. Let me review them quickly. The first best practice is to identify potential missionaries, create on-ramps for them. The second is to build up the missions team, missions committee. The third is delineate or distinguish local outreach from global cross-cultural missions. The fourth is create and cultivate global partnerships. And the fifth and final one, get to know your agency partners. Michael, you have referenced a lot of different things. We've got different episodes of the podcast. We will put all of that, those topics that relate, in the show notes. But are there other resources that you might like to mention to our audience?
I think the biggest one would be our Missio graphics that are up on Missio Nexus website. It's another one of the free things that we offer to the whole missions community. And there's some great infographics up there, especially that one on partnerships for this audience and this topic would be a highly valuable one. But there's numerous years worth of resources there that I would recommend checking out and downloading and using.
Very good. And just generally speaking, you can hear from Michael's expertise and the breadth of his experience. This is representative of the resource that Missio Nexus is as an association. And so if you're part of an agency or of a sending church or a missions committee, I invite you to check out those resources. They may be very helpful to you. Michael, we've just touched on these high points, but if any of our listeners would like to follow up with you somehow or reach out to you, how could they do that?
We'll provide my email address, and feel free to email me or go to missionexus.org, and you can check us out there and, look at the resources that are available. And if you're not a member of Missio Nexus, we would love you to consider that, not for our sake, but for the sake of the overall Great Commission community in North America. We need each other. We lean into each other. We're stronger when we're working together. So if you have any questions, I would love to interact.
Super. Thank you. Well, thank you for taking this time today to visit with me and with our audience and providing some of your expertise. May the Lord bless you as you continue on in your work with Missio Nexus.
Well, thank you, Max. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for this podcast and your ongoing work for the sake of the Great Commission.
Well, we're finished another episode packed with some great ideas. Remember to check out the show notes to scan through those resources and the related episodes here in the Global Missions Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, would you leave us a review in Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app? We would appreciate your feedback, and it helps others decide if they will give this podcast a try. Thank you in advance for spending just a couple of minutes doing that. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thank you for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.